Take a look at what happened.
Donald Trump was shot. This photo might end up in history lessons years later, not only because of how iconic it is, but also because of its importance, considering the current state of the country. Trump, unfortunately, is not the first presidential candidate who was the victim of an assassination attempt. There were similar cases throughout history. Some of them have even changed America forever. But before digging in, we need to clarify something first. This video only talks about presidential candidates who, at the time of their assassination attempts, were already nominated or still running for nomination of their parties. So, yeah, no case like JFK, Lincoln, or Bush Sr. Okay, so we go with the first case, Joseph Smith. Most of us know Joseph Smith as a religious leader and the founder of Mormonism and the Latter-day Saint movement. But do you know that Smith also ran for the presidency in the 1844 election? The motivation of Smith came from what he thought was the best for his followers. He sent letters to the leading contenders asking what they would do to protect the Mormons. After not receiving the response he wanted, Smith decided to go for his own presidency. We never know how Smith would be as a president because he couldn't live till the day of the election. It was early 1844, months before the presidential election. Smith was just thrown into jail after being charged with inciting riot and treason against the state. This was the result of a chain event, from Smith's order to destroy the Nauvoo Expositor print press to his declaration of martial law in Nauvoo. While Smith was in jail waiting for the trial, one day, an armed mob attacked the building. They painted their faces black. A huge gunfight happened. Smith's brother Hiram died right after. After using all the shots in his pistol to defend himself, Smith jumped out of the window to escape. However, while he was trying to do that, the mob hit him in the back and the chest. Some said Smith died instantly after hitting the ground. Some said he did not. The outcome was the same. Smith was assassinated. He became the first presidential candidate to be killed. Unlike Smith, the next candidate was a much more popular figure, and he also didn't die from the assassination attempt. His name is Theodore Roosevelt. The year was 1912, and Teddy was running for office one more time. His handpicked successor and former friend, the then incumbent President William Howard Taft, disappointed him. He was far from a true progressive as Teddy expected, and the former president decided to run against Taft under a third party. On the 14th of October 1912, Theodore Roosevelt just finished his dinner at the Gilpatrick Hotel in Wisconsin. He left the hotel to enter an open car while the crowd was cheering him. In the crowd, there was a guy named John Schrank. He had followed the former president from New Orleans to Milwaukee. When he saw Roosevelt appear, Schrank decided to act. The shot was fired and hit Roosevelt's chest. Teddy, however, did not collapse as Schrank expected. The shooter soon was captured. The crowd went crazy shouting, "Kill him," or "Hang him," but the former president just ordered to bring Schrank to him. "What did you do it for?" Roosevelt asked him. No response from Schrank, and Teddy continued, "Oh, what's the use? Turn him over to the police." He didn't forget to add, "Officers, take charge of him and see that there is no violence done to him." Roosevelt then returned to the crowd and opened his speech like nothing happened. "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." And he unbuttoned his vest, revealed what saved him from death. A bullet-riddled 50-page speech, and delivered this famous line, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The former president later went on with his campaign speech as scheduled for more than 50 minutes, although the bullet was still in his chest and the blood was still seeping into his shirt. That bullet became a part of Roosevelt's body for the rest of his life. What happened to the shooter, by the way? He was arrested and pleaded guilty. For the motive, Schrank said that it was because he didn't like a third-term president. Later, psychologists declared that Schrank was not a sane person. He claimed that the late President McKinley's ghost visited him in his dream and told him to assassinate Roosevelt for his revenge. Schrank then was transmitted to a mental hospital where he spent the rest 29 years of his life. Roosevelt didn't believe that Schrank was insane. He went on with his presidential campaign anyway and lost to Democratic candidate Woodrow Wilson. This was expected because of how the Republicans' vote was split after Roosevelt decided to run as a third-party candidate. Theodore Roosevelt continued to live for another 7 years after the assassination attempt. The next presidential candidate, however, was not as lucky as Teddy. His name is Robert Francis Kennedy, or RFK. He is the younger brother of the 35th U.S. President John Fitzgerald Kennedy, or JFK. Like his brother, RFK is considered an icon of modern liberalism. After JFK was assassinated in 1963, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the office. Despite hating each other, Johnson and Kennedy continued to work together until the former decided to leave in 1964. 1968 has remained one of the craziest years in U.S. history. Riots were everywhere in the country. The Tet Offensive exposed the lie of Johnson's administration. The popularity of Johnson sank, and he decided to not run for another term. The civil rights champion Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated 4 days later, which deepened the unrest. During the chaotic situation, Kennedy emerged as a promising candidate for the office. He supported civil rights and wanted to end the Vietnam War as soon as possible, which both were exactly what the Americans wanted. On June 4th, 1968, Kennedy just won the California presidential election. The next day, he addressed his campaign supporters in the embassy ballroom of the Ambassador Hotel. After the speech, Kennedy walked through the ballroom and shook hands with the crowd. That's when it happened. He was transferred to the hospital to undergo surgery. Despite all the efforts to save him, Kennedy passed away the next day, 25 hours after the assassination. Kennedy was shot multiple times. The fatal shot entered his right ear. The other two entered at the rear of his right armpit. Who shot him? He is Sirhan Sirhan, a Palestinian Jordanian man who immigrated to the US with his family. He was never happy with his life in the States, the country he thought was the friend of his enemy, Israel. The motive behind the assassination is quite easy to understand. Sirhan is an anti-Zionist and pro-Palestine, while Kennedy is a pro-Israel. After learning about RFK's support for Israel, Sirhan determined that RFK must be killed. Sirhan was sentenced to death in 1969, but was commuted to a life sentence 3 years later. He is still alive, by the way. The RFK's assassination shocked the US, even to this day. Like his older brother, people are full of what-if questions when discussing RFK. If he could survive, win the election, and deliver what he promised, many things would have changed completely. The Vietnam War, for example, could have ended much sooner instead of being prolonged by the next President Nixon just for him to win the election comfortably. Talking about Nixon, in the 1972 presidential election, which he won, another candidate became the victim of an assassination attempt, George Wallace, also known as the most influential loser of the 20th century. He ran for office 4 times, 3 under the Democratic Party and 1 under a third party. He failed every time. In the 1972 election, Wallace once again declared himself a Democratic candidate. Despite being remembered for his segregationist view, this time Wallace announced that he was no longer a supporter of that view. His campaign went well. Would he finally succeed this time? The answer is no. On May 15, 1972, while campaigning at the Laurel Shopping Center in Laurel, Maryland, Wallace was shot 4 times. 1 bullet hit his abdomen, 1 hit his chest, and 1 hit his spinal column, making him paralyzed from the waist down for the rest of his life. The shooter, Arthur Bremer, then said that he did it just because he wanted to be famous. He was sentenced to 63 years in prison, later reduced to 53 years. If you're curious, Bremer was released in 2007 and is now still alive. About Wallace, he survived, but his election campaign had to stop following the assassination attempt. He tried again 4 years later, but still failed. Now fast forward to 2024, with the most recent assassination attempt on a presidential candidate. Donald Trump, I don't think we need to talk too much about this case, because Trump is insanely famous and the attempted assassination on him is still very recent. However, we still will give you context about this very briefly. Donald Trump, the 45th president of the United States, failed to get elected in 2020. He couldn't accept that loss and refused a peaceful power transfer to the next president. You know the event I'm talking about, right?
We're not gonna take it anymore! This is our country! That's it!
Of course, it went nowhere. Trump has become a more and more polarized figure. 4 years later, he tried to get the job again. On July 13th, just 2 days before the 2024 Republican National Convention, Trump holds a rally at the Butler Farm Showgrounds, Pennsylvania. Just a few minutes into his speech, people heard the sounds of a shooting gun. The former president was shot in the upper right ear. He luckily escaped the death by just a few inches. One man in the crowd died and 2 others were critically injured. The shooter was killed right after firing. He then was identified as a 20-year-old guy named Thomas Crooks. The real question is how the Secret Service did not know he climbed to a nearby rooftop, just about 100 meters in the first place. This assassination attempt is still under investigation. We do not know yet if the motivation is political or not. Still too soon to jump to any conclusion, but you have to admit it. Hate him or love him, this photo of Donald Trump is just iconic.